I have some brand new Star Trek fan fiction. Please subscribe at the end. Captain's Log 3454.8. Supplemental. The Enterprise is on a routine mission to resupply a Federation colony on the third moon of Randor when we intercepted an unknown coded transmission from an unidentifiable source. We are now at a yellow alert and are attempting to decode whatever messages are being sent. The doors to the turbolift opened and Uhura, totally nude, stepped through and walked to the front of the bridge where she stood in front of the main viewing screen. She raised her arms to address the bridge crew and stated, "I am here for Captain Kirk. I am destined to carry his child," she announced. "What the hell?" Sulu asked as he turned to face Kirk, who was sitting behind him. Kirk stood up and addressed Uhura. "What are you doing? Put some clothes on. This is not a strip club." Sulu asked, "Do you want me to do something, sir?" "Call security and tell them to bring a blanket," Kirk replied. Uhura took a few steps towards Kirk. "You don't need to call security, Captain. I am no threat to you or anyone here on the bridge. I am here to offer myself and my body to you for your pleasure." Just then, the turbolift doors opened and Spock entered, holding a bowl of plomeek soup. He shouted, "I don't want your plomeek soup," and threw it towards the front of the bridge, splattering Kirk, Sulu, and Chekhov, who were sitting in their helm stations. Kirk turned to Spock and yelled, "What are you doing?" as he wiped the soup out of the back of his hair. "Have you gone insane?" Scott stepped over to the communication station where Uhura usually monitored messages and alerted Kirk. The computer had deciphered part of the unknown intercepted message. "Tell security we have an issue with Spock." "And what do the messages say?" Kirk asked. "You don't need to hear the message," an unfamiliar voice called out from the science station. "I have a new message for you that you will find more interesting." The bridge crew turned to face this unknown humanoid being standing where Spock usually stood. "Who are you, and what message do you have for me?" Kirk asked. "My name is Doran, and I am from a planet you have yet to discover," the alien replied. "The message was not intended for you, but since you have discovered our existence, or at least you soon will, we decided to make contact first." "Does your presence have anything to do with the strange behaviors of my crew?" Kirk asked. "We have everything to do with what has occurred," Doran replied. "Would you mind explaining why my communications officer is standing naked, offering her body to me, and why my science officer is throwing soup across the bridge?" "Yes, Captain, I will explain," Doran replied. "We are from your future, 355 years into your future, and we have come to collect." "Collect what?" Kirk asked. "Your offspring," Doran replied. "In our time, your descendant will have more value than you can imagine." "You want to take my son?" Kirk asked. "Son, daughter, does not matter to us. But we need an infant, and your son is too old for the journey back." "I don't have an infant," Kirk stated, as fact. Sulu spoke up. "I think I know why Uhura is offering her body to you, Captain." Kirk looked to Uhura and back to Doran. "I don't know much about your race, but I don't think you know how we humans work. We aren't cattle. You can't just breed us with a whim. We are an intelligent race, obviously more intelligent than yours. And what about Spock? Why is he behaving like a lunatic?" "I don't understand the Vulcan's reaction," Doran replied, "but I'm sure it has something to do with our presence. If I were you, I'd put him in chains and lock him down before he becomes more aggressive. Soup is one thing, but murder is quite different." Kirk looked over to Spock, who was hunched over, holding his head. "Are you all right, Spock?" Kirk asked. "I am not all right," Spock replied, with blood dripping from his mouth and nose onto the bridge. "Call McCoy and get Spock to sickbay," Kirk barked. "Yes, sir," Sulu replied, pressing buttons on his console. "Why do you need my offspring so badly?" Kirk asked the alien. In 20 years, you will lead an uprising that will be the cause of the death of millions of innocent beings on the planet Temple. You will be charged with war crimes and executed as the only disgraced Starfleet captain in history. We need your offspring for our museum of crime to be put on display as the only living descendant of the infamous Death Captain Kirk. I don't believe you for a minute. But if you are from the future, why not stop me from what I'm accused of and save millions of innocent lives? You could kill me now, and none of your accusations would come true, Kirk replied. We are not in the business of changing history. We are in the entertainment business, and your offspring will make us rich beyond imagination. Now we need to get on with the breeding process so we can be on our way, Torin replied. Kirk pulled his phaser and shot Uhura dead. Her nude body flipped over the rail and fell to the bridge floor below. Kirk spun back and aimed his phaser at Torin and said, "Now what?" Torin grinned and raised his arms as if defeated. "We are not stupid, Captain. We will always have a backup plan." Just then, the turbolift doors opened and Janice Rand stepped through, nude and ready to breed. Captain's Log 3425.5. The Enterprise has delivered a package of scientific equipment to the surface of an M-class planet Torin to aid the Starfleet science crew in the study of an anomaly discovered buried inside an ancient pyramid. Spock, Uhura, and Sulu assisted with the transfer, and after 3 days on the planet, beamed back to assume their regular duties. Captain Kirk was called to the bridge when an alert was received from the crew on the planet below. As the doors to the turbolift opened, Kirk stepped through as Uhura stood and struck him in the back with a double-fisted blow, shoving Kirk down the steps where he landed on his face. "What are you doing?" Scott yelled from the engineering station and jumped the rail to check on Kirk. Uhura scrambled down the steps and jumped on Kirk, flipping him over like a high school wrestler. She straddled him, raised her arms, clasping her hands together, ready to strike Kirk in the face. "No, you don't," Scott yelled, shoving Uhura off Kirk. Sulu asked, "Do you need help?" looking down at the scuffle. Kirk sat up and wiped the blood off his lower lip. "If you don't mind," Kirk replied. Sulu slid out of his chair and put Kirk in a headlock, attempting to strangle him. Kirk's eyes bugged out of his head as he tried to break free, but he was no match for Sulu as he tightened his grip. Scott stood up, pulled his phaser, and shot Sulu in the head. The phaser was set to stun, so Sulu let go his death grip and slumped back against his chair. "Are you all right, Captain?" Scott asked. Kirk took a hold of the navigator station and used it to help him up. "What's going on?" Kirk asked, looking around the bridge. The turbo lift opened, and Dr. McCoy stepped onto the bridge, holding a pad in his hand. "Captain, we have a problem," McCoy said, taking in the scene. "What's going on?" McCoy asked. "Watch out for Uhura. She and Sulu both attacked me," Kirk replied. By this time, Uhura was standing next to Spock, who was sitting at his science station. "I have bad news," McCoy said aloud. "Sulu, Uhura, and Spock were all affected by the transporter on the last beam up. Somehow, they all report a significant gene mutation that regulates aggression." "No shit," Kirk replied. "I think my rib's broken. Why did they attack me?" McCoy turned to Uhura and Spock. "Why did you attack the captain?" McCoy asked. Uhura replied, "I don't know. Seemed like the right thing to do at the time." "And you, Spock?" "I did not attack the captain." "Not yet," Spock replied. Kirk stepped up to the captain's chair and pressed the call button. "Security to the bridge. Immediately," Kirk said. "Spock, Uhura, you need to report to sickbay." "No, Captain, I will not," Spock replied. "None of us will. And I think you will find, Doctor, that the transporter had nothing to do with our transformation." "Then what in the blazes is wrong with you?" McCoy asked. "Nothing is wrong with any of us. We have simply changed our outlook on life and perspective. Everyone on board the Enterprise will need to beam down to the planet as soon as possible." "Why do you need to clock me in the head?" Kirk asked. "We knew you wouldn't agree to our plan," Spock replied. McCoy asked, "What is on the planet that is so important that we all need to beam down?" "You will find out when you get there," Spock replied. "Did you think this out?" Kirk asked. "How would you get 420 crew to beam down to the planet?" "Easy," Spock replied with a smile. "I have set a photon torpedo to detonate on board in 3 hours. That torpedo will set off others and cause a chain reaction that will destroy the ship." "I don't think anyone will want to be on board when that occurs," Spock replied. "I was going to make an announcement once you were dead." Kirk looked to Scott. "Can he do that?" "If anyone can, Spock can," Scott replied. "Look into it and do what you can do to stop it," Kirk snapped. "Aye, Captain," Scott said, and turned back to his station. "Don't bother," Spock said. "I deactivated the failsafe and entered a password only I know that will allow any access to the programming." "Spock is right," Scott said. "I can't gain access to the weapon system at all. I'm locked out and the password has been changed. I do detect a rise in the temperature in the torpedo bay. I don't think he's joking." "Vulcans don't joke," Spock replied. "I would advise you make an announcement to the crew and start the transfer. By my calculations, we can get everyone to the planet's surface, but there won't be any time to spare. Every minute we debate is a minute lost." "And crew," Uhura said. "What will happen to my crew once they beam down?" Kirk asked. "I have no desire to explain," Spock replied, "and there is nothing you can do. Time is not a luxury for you." McCoy, at his wits, said, "Do it, Jim, before it's too late. Save your crew." "Save them for what?" Kirk asked. "We may still be sending them to die. Maybe the Enterprise blowing up would be more humane." "If you only knew," Sulu said, with a menacing grin, now sitting behind the navigator station. "If you only knew." Captain's Log 3412.5. Supplemental. Chief Engineer Scott has requested my physical presence in engineering to report an anomaly that will put the Enterprise at risk. "What is it, Scott?" Kirk asked as he entered engineering. "Why couldn't you use the communicator?" Scott led Kirk over to a display panel near the dilithium crystal chamber and pointed at the screen. "See that?" Scott asked. "Antimatter is very, very hard to come by, and we are down to 10%. If we can't figure out where we are losing, we won't be able to achieve warp drive, and we are currently in the middle of a galaxy with few options. Our top impulse drive will take a century to get us to a habitable planet." "When did you notice? Did you get an alert?" Kirk asked. "Negative. The alert system has been disabled," Scott replied, "and I have no idea who did it. Whoever did has enough knowledge of the system to not need a password or leave a trace." "Are we in immediate danger?" Kirk asked. "No, but whoever did this may have other ideas in mind," Scott replied. "Warp 2 is the best we can achieve for now, and that won't last forever." "How is antimatter supplied?" Kirk asked. "We have to get it from a starbase," Scott replied, "and it can take weeks to recharge the cells when we are scheduled for maintenance." Kirk used the communicator on the wall and called Spock. "Yes, Captain," Spock replied. "Spock, Scott has alerted me to a potential situation. In your estimation, how long can we survive with the current supplies on board?" Kirk asked. Spock paused as he did the calculations in his head. "Approximately 90 days, Spock replied. Kirk turned to Scott and asked, "Will the antimatter affect life support?" "No, it's on a different system altogether," Scott replied. "That power comes from a magnetic field and battery system that recharges automatically." Spock asked, "May I ask what's wrong?" "We are going to lose warp drive if we can't figure out how to get more antimatter," Kirk replied. "Interesting," Spock replied. "Meet me in the conference room," Kirk said, and motioned for Scott to follow. In the conference room, Kirk, Scott, McCoy, Spock's intern, Darla Wren, and Security Officer Dickerson met to discuss the alarming situation. "Now what?" McCoy asked. He was angry and concerned. "How did this happen?" I think I know, Spock replied. Well, don't keep us in the dark, McCoy snapped. Spock looked to his intern and raised his eyebrow. Do you wish to explain? He asked her. Why are you looking at me? Intern Wren replied. She was a master-level student from Starfleet with 6 weeks to graduation. You are the only person besides me that could alter the computer and drain the antimatter, Spock replied. That means nothing. Maybe you did it, Darla snapped back. Who has motive? Spock asked. McCoy asked, what are you getting at? I fired Miss Wren as my intern 2 weeks ago for gross negligence and incompetence. I felt she was looking for a way to get back at me, and I think she has found it. She must not be that incompetent if she was able to drain the antimatter and hide it, McCoy replied. Obviously, Spock replied. You're wrong, Mr. Spock, and you will never prove I did anything, Darla replied. McCoy said, from what I understand, we will have plenty of time to figure out what happened, at least until the supplies run out. Kirk replied, all we have to do is contact Starfleet and they will send out a rescue ship. I wouldn't worry. I'm sure she considered Starfleet would intervene, Spock said. I wouldn't be surprised if she had a backup plan. Well, do you? McCoy yelled. I have nothing to say, Darla replied. Are you planning to blow up the Enterprise? McCoy asked. What else have you done? If Mr. Spock is so smart, he can figure it out, Darla replied. He seems to have all the answers. What are you going to do, Spock? McCoy yelled. She's your intern. Former, Spock replied. I suggest torture. That's a bit much, even for you, Spock, McCoy replied. Do you have any other ideas? Spock asked. She sabotaged the Enterprise, and she will not allow a rescue. If you want to survive, I suggest you come up with a better way. I have a truth-inducing drug, McCoy said. Let's try that first. Darla pulled a phaser from under her dress and aimed it at McCoy. Not in this lifetime, Doctor. You won't get any information from me. Spock leaned over, and before she could defend herself, received a Vulcan nerve pinch. That's my 3 pages. Right over here, I have a link to all of my stories. Just click on that right there. I have like 25 of them. And these cards are pretty cool. I hope this audio worked out. I came here on purpose. But check out all of my Star Trek fan fiction right here on Keith Trim Art.